You heard from Dr. Nitzviki about some of the marvellous advances in natural health research that are currently taking place at the WWII Research Institute in California. With knowledge of this information, one would think that governments all over the world would be hurrying to take advantage of this research. In fact, of course, as we know, this is not in fact the case. In fact, as I will be explaining this evening, governments, and particularly at a European level, what we call the Brussels EU, are actively taking steps to prevent us from accessing these therapies. So my presentation this evening will describe some of the key threats to natural therapies. I will also explain where these threats are coming from and why. I will describe some of the historical roots of these threats. I will explain where in history the roots of these attacks on our health come from. And finally, I will expand on some of the ideas explained by Dr. Nitzviki in terms of ways in which you can help yourselves and us to fight back. So to begin, let's have a look at some of the key threats to natural health. I should say there are many, but there are three key threats in Europe that we need to be very aware of. The first one is something called the Food Supplements Directive. This is a piece of European legislation. It started life coming from the Brussels EU. And its aim is to set restrictions on the types and the doses of vitamins and minerals that can be contained in supplements. But to hide this threat, to try to lead you to believe that this will be done scientifically, the Brussels EU is pretending that there is a scientific method in place that will bring about a scientifically valid dose for each individual nutrient. In fact, however, the methodologies that the Brussels EU will be using to calculate these levels are deeply unscientific and very, very flawed. But of course, this is deliberate. I'll say right away, this is no accident. The fact that these methods for setting low amounts of these vitamins and minerals is so flawed is not at all an accident. The second key threat is something called the Traditional Herbal Medicinal Products Directive. And this, again, is a piece of European legislation, and this started out life in 2004. And what this does, this subjects natural herbal medicines to a very restrictive regulatory regime, whereby all herbs that do not specifically get authorization from the Brussels EU are banned. Just like that. So, by destroying your access to herbal medicine in this way, the EU's goal, as we shall see in a little while, is to protect the interests of the pharmaceutical industry. That's it. That's the goal. But that is not all. Because in the attempt to curtail even the spreading of information about these therapies, the Brussels EU has passed something called a regulation on nutrition and health claims. And under this legislation, all suggestions that a particular food or a nutrient has beneficial properties, or even that there's a relationship between food, nutrition and health, are banned unless specifically authorised by the European Commission. And get this, even if scientific evidence for the claim exists. So, to the Brussels EU, it doesn't matter that there is scientific evidence to prove that a specific group of nutrients, let's say, have an effect, a positive effect upon cancer. That doesn't matter. The fact that there's evidence to the Brussels EU is besides the point, because the aim is to ban such claims, ban the communication of this information. So, straight away we can learn something very important from this, because in its desperation to protect the pharma industry, the Brussels EU is resorting to the most distinctive hallmark of all dictatorships, and that's a prohibition on free speech. So let's take a little closer look now at the source of these threats. The source of these threats is the pharmaceutical industry, but what you need to understand is that there is a very close relationship between the Brussels EU and the pharmaceutical industry. So close, in fact, is this relationship that 3 years ago, the Brussels EU openly announced its ambition to become what it called the pharmacy of the world. And I should say that those are not my words. I haven't made this phrase up. This was actually used at the press conference when the scheme was launched. The scheme involves currently around 2 billion euros, and it offers grants to universities and to drug companies. And the European Commission is contributing 1 billion euros of taxpayers' money, our money, to this scheme. Because what it wants is to enable drug companies to advertise their products directly to us on television, the radio, the internet, newspapers, throughout the EU. Contrast that with the way it is treating information about nutrition and health claims, as I described earlier. This is no accident. And this is what the Brussels EU is trying to protect. Last year, total sales of pharmaceutical drugs in the EU were valued at $253 billion. That's US dollars. Globally, last year, drug sales were worth $875 billion. Not million, billion dollars. By 2015, forecasts suggest that total drug sales will have reached $1,100 billion. That's $1.1 trillion, in fact. An astonishing, truly astonishing amount of money. But this, of course, forces us to ask a question. Because all over Europe, there are charities, medical charities, collecting money in aid of research into drugs for treating all types of diseases. So we have to ask ourselves, don't we? Why on earth does the pharmaceutical industry need our money when it has an income, an annual income approaching $1 trillion a year? I would also like to say something about GMOs, not just because this is an important issue, but because there is a relationship between the companies producing GMOs and the pharmaceutical industry. First, let's look at the facts. The facts are that the Brussels EU is suppressing information on GMOs. It is trying to prevent the release of information that shows the dangers of altering the genetic structures of the elements contained in our food in this way. A few years ago, a group in the United Kingdom, Wales, one of the constituent countries in the UK, uncovered an attempt by UK and Brussels EU officials which had apparently enabled a highly damaging study on GM maize produced by Monsanto to be covered up. The scientists who had seen the study were told not to talk about it. The study showed that this form of maize produced by Monsanto was dangerous to health, and that a major cover-up, in fact, was underway to protect Monsanto and the regulatory authorities who had said it was safe in the first place. But of course, despite these concerns, this variety of maize remains available for use, remains authorized for use throughout the Brussels EU. But there's more, because the plan of the Brussels EU, the intention of the Brussels EU, despite knowing that we don't want to consume these foods, is actually to boost production of them. Documents obtained by a British newspaper a couple of years ago show that European leaders want agricultural representatives and industry, which means Monsanto and their friends, to be more vocal, to be more outspoken, to counteract what they called the vested interests, get this, of environmentalists. In the real world, the vested interests are the companies like Monsanto, who stand to make billions of euros from these substances. You and I, if you like, the environmentalists, those people who are concerned for our health and the health of our families and the welfare of the environment, our views are categorized by the Brussels EU as vested interests. The complete reverse of reality, in fact. And what brings the issue of drugs and GMOs together is the issue of patents. Patents, as we shall see, are the key tools to control the world. Because patents on products, patents on pharma drugs and GMO seeds produce hundreds of billions of euros every year. But natural substances, vitamins, organic food, cannot be patented. You couldn't say, for example, that you invented vitamin C. It exists in nature. Pharmaceutical chemicals, of course, can be patented. They don't exist in nature and they are synthesized in laboratories. So, because of this possibility to patent substances and control markets, what you find is that many of the companies who are involved in pharmaceutical production are also involved in the production of GMOs. But let's not allow ourselves to think that this is simply a European problem, because it isn't. In fact, it's a global problem. The goal of the EU is to export its undemocratic model for government to the rest of the world. already around the world there are several examples of EU-like governmental structures springing up. In Southeast Asia, we have the ASEAN, which is the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. In Africa, we have the African Union. There are two EU-like bodies in South America, and so on. So, with this in mind, I think this is a good moment to look at the origins of the Brussels EU. Let's take a look at where it is that this structure came from. To do this, we have to go back in history about 60 years. And at this point, the Second World War was 2 years old. But the Nazi regime was maintaining official institutes, but with one purpose only: to prepare the future economic and political shape of the world for a Nazi IG Farben victory in World War II. IG Farben, I'll say a little bit more about those in a few moments, but IG Farben was the pharmaceutical and chemical cartel that financed the rise of the Nazis and that was deeply involved in the perpetration of World War II. But one of the institutes that the Nazis were maintaining was something called the Central Research Institute for National Economic Order and Greater Sphere Economy, and this was based in Dresden, in Germany. And the head of this office was this man here, Arno Scholter. In 1941, Scholter published the Nazi IG Farben cartel plans for a post-World War II Europe in a book. You can see it there. This book translates as the Greater Sphere Cartel, an instrument of industrial market order in a new Europe. And the significance of this book cannot be underestimated, because the parallels that it contains between the Nazis' plans for post-World War II Europe and what we have today, the Brussels EU, are absolutely astonishing. 3 examples. The European Commission is described in Scholter's book. The concept of an unelected executive body at the head of Europe. The European Commission, for those of you who don't know, consists of 27 men, one from each member state of the Brussels EU. But none of them are elected. We, the people, have no means of voting them into office or out of office. The system of EU directives is also described in Scholter's book. We touched upon a couple of those a few moments ago. But perhaps most significantly of all, the finalization of what was called the Master Agreement, which was governed details of any ongoing changes or supplementary legal agreements. Because almost 60 years later, this Master Agreement took form and shape in what we now call the Lisbon Treaty. We'll come to the Lisbon Treaty in a few moments, but there is further proof of the Nazis' intended war aims that emerged during the Nuremberg war crimes trial against IG Farben, which took place between 1947 and 1948. There were 13 trials at Nuremberg, and the trial against Farben was the 6th one. But it was almost certainly the most important one. The significance, though, of the Nazis' intended war aims here involves this man, Fritz Termeer. Because he was found, he was a senior director of Farben, and he was found guilty at Nuremberg of plunder, spoliation, and his counsel his legal counsel specifically stated that the concept of a total European economic area had shaped his client's, meaning Tamir, his client's aims. So what he was essentially saying was it was an attempt to defend Tamir against the prosecution by saying that, well, yes, but his goal was honourable. It was a goal for a total European economic area. It was a very flimsy, weak attempt at defence. But what it tells us is that the concept of a Europe described in Salter's book was no accident. It confirms that the aims of Tamir and Farben were to bring about the creation of this economic Europe rather than a Europe for the people. Tamir was responsible for some of the most despicable crimes imaginable. He was responsible for the construction and operation of the IG Farben factory at the Auschwitz concentration camp. He was found guilty of plunder, spoliation, slavery, and mass murder, and he was condemned by the court to 7 years in prison. But despite the appalling, truly disgraceful, unimaginable nature of his crimes, he was released after only 2 years. And in 1956, despite knowing that he was a convicted war criminal, the drug company Bayer appointed him chairman of its supervisory board, a post he went on to hold for another 8 years. But there's a lot more. The evidence of the Nazi roots, the Nazi origins in the EU, go much further, because there are things that the Brussels EU does not want you to know about its first president. This man here, Walter Hallstein, was the first founding president of the European Commission. Because before and during World War II, Hallstein was a member of official Nazi organizations. One of them, the Association of National Socialist German Lawyers, was founded in 1933, immediately after the Nazis had assumed power. 3 years later, in 1936, it was converted to the notorious Nazi Association of Law Protectors. Now, membership of this organization was restricted to those people showing uncompromising support for and participation in the Nazi ideals. Well, ladies and gentlemen, Hallstein was a member of both of these organizations. We know this from a memorandum sent by Hallstein to the representative of the Nazi government at the University of Rostock in Germany in 1935. You can see a copy of this and a translation in English on the right. But there's more. It wasn't just his membership of Nazi organizations that we can hold against Hallstein. We know a great deal about his personal ideology, and we know this from a speech that we refer to as his conquest speech, because the concepts and the aims described in this speech fit completely with the aims of the Nazi war machine and the creation of the Europe that we're talking about tonight. And the content of this speech, which I'll summarize briefly now, I promise you will change your perspective on the Brussels EU forever. A key aspect of this speech concerned what Hallstein misleadingly described as the link-up of Austria and large parts of what was then known as Czechoslovakia with Germany. Because rather than referring to these territories as having been invaded and conquered, taken by force, murderous force, he described their seizing as being part of, and I quote, the creation of the greater German Reich and the legal Germanization of the new territories. And he specifically said that the failure to create a unified legal system, now we know what that means, for Greater Germany was one of the unfinished tasks and failures of the Second German Reich. So that's the period in history at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century that led to the First World War. He also described the legal process for the creation of this unified legal system as being the issuing of directives. Further proof, in other words, that the concepts described in Scholter's book were real. And revealingly, given that the rise, as I mentioned a few moments ago, the rise of the Nazis and the preparations for World War II had been financed by IG Farben, he described the creation of the Greater German Reich as being an economic event of sheer unimaginable consequences, which ties in again with what Tamir said, or his attorney said at Nuremberg. But an economic event of sheer unimaginable consequences. Well, he was right about the second part, the part that the consequences were sheer and unimaginable. But the first, as I say, tying in as it does with the evidence from Tamir's attorney, given under oath at Nuremberg, tells us a lot. But the most shocking part, perhaps, of what Hallstein said in this speech was that one of the most important laws to be introduced in the annexed countries, the invaded countries, was the law for the protection of the German blood and the German honor. In other words, Hallstein was advocating the imposition of the Nuremberg racial laws as the highest priority. The Nuremberg racial laws, of course, excluded German Jews from Reich citizenship and prohibited them from marrying or having sexual relations with persons of German or related blood. This was the ideology of the man who was the first and founding president of the European Commission. Now, the authors of the book, my co-authors, Dr. Arth and Dr. Nitzviki, describing these routes at greater detail, we understand that this, if it's the first time you have heard about it, is deeply shocking. In fact, you'll be wondering how it is we can say these things and what evidence we have for Hallstein's speech. Well, we have good evidence, proof, in fact. We managed to obtain a copy of Hallstein's handwritten notes for the speech. You hear one copy, one page reproduced here, the others are available on our website. But it's not just his handwritten notes that confirm this. We also managed to obtain a copy of a newspaper report published the following day about Hallstein's speech. It describes the attendees, which included the entire elite of the Nazi state in the region, confirms the date and the venue of the speech. And we also have a copy of the official invitation to the event, confirming the title of the speech and that the venue was in Rostock. So ask yourself, how did a man with an ideology such as this come to be the founding president of the Brussels EU? I offer to you, ladies and gentlemen, that this could not have happened did he not have support, encouragement and help from the very people, the very cartels that are the prime beneficiaries of the Brussels EU we know today. Coming back to the present, let's take a quick little look at this thing we call the Lisbon Treaty. This is the master agreement that Arno Scholte talked about in 1941. It would be possible to talk about this specific treaty for the rest of this evening. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to focus on a couple of points, the key points. What this treaty did is establish the laws of the Brussels EU as having primacy over national laws. So, in the Brussels EU today, the laws of Poland, the national laws of my country, the UK, are secondary to laws created at European level. The treaty is divided into two parts. The first part is called the Treaty on European Union, and the second part is called the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union. But there's something in this treaty, not only have you not been told about, but during the arguments and negotiations that took place prior to its passing, I am not personally aware of any focus being put on this fact in the media or anywhere. Because what it does, it places the Brussels EU definitively above the law. Because to all intents and purposes, one of the parts tagged on the end, after the end of these two treaties that I mentioned that make up the Lisbon Treaty, there's a bunch of things called protocols. And one of them, the protocol on the privileges and immunities of the European Union, makes the Brussels EU premises and buildings exempt from search. So no matter what crimes we, the people, might feel are taking place, being perpetrated from there, no search of the premises can ever be carried out. But not just that. Members of the unelected European Commission are immune from legal proceedings in respect of acts performed by them in their official capacity, and including their words spoken or written. But not just that, they continue to enjoy this immunity even after they have ceased to hold office. Now, consider that. An unelected European Commission, its premises and buildings are exempt from search, and its members are totally immune from prosecution in terms of acts performed by them in their official capacity. In any language, ladies and gentlemen, this is dictatorship. What else do we need? What evidence do we need other than that? Because think of this. When unelected leaders take control in other countries, in far-off lands, the Brussels EU is very quick to point its finger and call for free and fair elections to be held. Well, surely what's good enough for other countries ought to be good enough for the Brussels EU. But instead, what we have here now, today, in Europe, is an unelected presidential dictatorship. Article 15 of one of the components of the Lisbon Treaty created the post of European Union President. But rather than requiring an election, like in America, Barack Obama had to stand for election in order to become President of the United States. That didn't happen here. Because our President, this is our President, ladies and gentlemen, and none of us voted for him. I didn't vote for him. I didn't see any vote taking place where I could put a cross in a box. No, what Herman Van Rompuy had to do was to attend a job interview held by the Bilderberg group. This was widely reported. He had to meet with this elite circle of corporate interests that's under the control of David Rockefeller and chaired by the ex-EU Commissioner and pharma drug lobbyist, I might add, Etienne Davignon. The battle for democracy in Europe has lasted for centuries. It should have been over a long time ago. It is truly disgraceful that I even have to stand here today telling you these things. So next, we will look at one or two of the elements that you can help us with, support and participate in to help bring about positive change. Dr. Niedzwiecki talked briefly about the movement of life. What this is a global campaign for health, peace and social justice. It has to be a global campaign because, as I showed you earlier, the Brussels EU intends to export its model of undemocratic government worldwide. And also the most fundamental human rights are the rights to health and the right to life. Without these, none of the others can exist. But these rights are threatened by corporate interests who consider your body a marketplace. You probably consider that your body belongs to you. Well, it does. But to these people, to these members of this multinational cartel, your body simply represents a marketplace that it can use as an object for its drugs. These rights, the rights to health and life, will not be given to you voluntarily. You have to fight for them. It's not enough to understand this information yourself. With understanding comes the need, the requirement to pass it on. So defending these rights is the key goal of the movement of life. We have people afterwards, after this conference tonight, who can provide more information in the foyer outside. I urge you to come and get involved in this campaign. The movement of life is the umbrella under which many other activities fit. We don't have time to talk about all of them. I'm going to talk very briefly about two of them. One of them, Dr. Niedzwiecki talked about, the European Referendum Initiative. This is a campaign for citizens to have the right to vote in a referendum whenever significant changes are made to national or European laws. This was the referendum that we were denied on the Lisbon Treaty. There are three main aspects to this campaign. The first one on the Lisbon Treaty speaks for itself. So, in fact, does our petition for a Europe for the people, by the people. This petition, in a way, is self-explanatory. It describes the sort of Europe that should exist and that should replace the Europe of today. And finally, the referendum petition on natural remedies, again, speaks for itself. Many of you will probably be aware of this already. Dr. Niedzwiecki mentioned that over 40,000 people from Poland have now signed this. Europe-wide, over 250,000 people have now signed this petition. People from all 27 European Union member states. The website's available in 9 languages. If you see a language there that you are fluent in and can assist us with in creating additional languages for this or any other of our websites, please come forward this evening after the conference. We would very, very much appreciate your help. So support the campaign. Sign the 3 petitions and bring this website to the attention of everybody that you know. I'll talk very briefly about the World Health Alphabetization Campaign that Dr. Niedzwiecki mentioned. And I'll summarize the 5 goals. Goal 1, to end global health illiteracy by providing basic knowledge about the structure and function of the human body and the cellular origins of disease. Because most people today, as Dr. Niedzwiecki ably described, are unaware that the origins of disease lie at the cellular level, not at the level of organs. Goal 2 is to promote life-saving information about micronutrients and science-based natural health as the foundation for effective, safe and affordable healthcare. Also, build a new healthcare structure that's community-based, We don't need to depend upon multi-billion, trillion-dollar industries for our healthcare.